today I'd like to talk about consciousness in terms of identity and recognition, which depends on memory, and memory depends on experience. And from that combination you have knowledge stored in the memory, as it were. I'm not saying whether memory is integral to the brain or integral to the psyche, or there's an interface of memory in brain and psyche, but I see psyche as existing in a different dimension than the brain, and that consciousness is a formation of thought in the psyche. So essentially consciousness is not actually located in the brain, if you will, yet may be integral to its functioning. So you could say that your awareness of your consciousness is really your awareness of your thought. So at any given time, the moment you might think about being aware of your consciousness, you could say the immediate experience is an experience of thought. So you don't have to think of consciousness and thought as a specific content, other than that you're thinking about or observing the nature of thought and consciousness, you might say, in itself. So, you could say that in moments of quietness, in moments of forgetfulness, there can be a sense of just thought, pure thought, or consciousness being in a state of silence. But I'm not saying that as an absolute distinction from the stream of consciousness and the activity of memory, etc. I'm just trying to establish the fact that I think that you can sense, be aware of, recognize, understand, perceive, the basic quality of thought. And in that perception of thought, you might say is pure consciousness. Then you could say it's non-specific. Whereas if you're dealing with any particular content of consciousness, then it does become specific. And that specification is determined by memory, which presents a context in which you're thinking about a particular thing or an episode or an event that you remember or that you're in contact with. So whether you're thinking about the past, the present or the future, the stream of consciousness dependent on memory is, you might say, always functioning. And within that process, which I see as transformative, even though it's moving from the past to the present to the future, as it were, it's not in a linear fashion. You can specifically think about the past or specifically think about the future, but I think the direct experiencing in consciousness, the stream of consciousness, the associations of memory and the movement of thought, I think the basic sense is a sense of transformation. And what's undergoing that transformation as you're living is a sense of identity, and which means that the flow of thought, which is the flow of memory, is really the flow of myriad of identifications that you have. And you could say there's an identity specific to each thing that you're remembering. So you're remembering your childhood, you're remembering watching a film, you're remembering a conversation with a friend, you're remembering a dream. And in each case you can say, I am. So I am really is the indication of identity. Now, in contrast to that, I'm proposing that the self is not synonymous with identity, and you could say that identity is generally known as ego. So at any specific time, the central identity or dominant identity is actually ego. And self, I feel, is in a different dimension than the psyche, and that's referred to as the mind or the one mind, which in itself, in contrast to the physical body and consciousness and psyche, is non-specific. So the spiritual dimension of the one mind exists in its own right, quite independent of the psyche and the body, and doesn't depend on memory and recognition or identity and ego, because the self, in its innate oneness, is not only not in time, but it's not in transformation. So it's not in the body, it's not in the psyche consciousness, and it's simply the fact of being always one. So no matter what you're doing in your body, no matter what you're doing in your consciousness, which are both changing processes of change, there is no change in self or the mind. So you could say the mind is ever present, no matter what the body, no matter what the psyche is doing. Whether you're walking by the river, reading a book, having a dream, astral travelling, wherever you go in your psyche and your body, self is ever present as an awareness. So you could say spiritual awareness enfolds everything you do, everything you experience. The subtle flow of memory and consciousness means that if you're reading a book, so I am reading a book, and while I'm reading the book I think, oh, I'll go into the kitchen and make a cup of tea. So I am reading a book becomes I am going to make a cup of tea. So you get up and you make a cup of tea, and you come back into the sitting room and continue reading the book. Now, you could say the I am is the same both in reading the book and going into the kitchen. But if you say that when you're reading the book, you're not using your body as such. I mean, you're using your eyes, but you're not moving your body. When you go into the kitchen, you're moving your body. So you're very identified with your body when you're going in the kitchen. When you're sitting down, you could say your identity is very focused in reading the book and internalizing the story in your consciousness. Now, if you bring in the factor of self, because the self is one, because the one is empty of all content, of all conditions, of all contexts, of all identity, then it doesn't really matter whether you, in a sense, it doesn't matter what identification you have. It doesn't matter what your ego identity is doing in your body and in your consciousness, as it were. And it's not the concern of self to be involved in the processes of the physical universe or the psychic dimension. I mean, self is self. Self is free within its own dimension. So you could say the domain of the self is silence, is stillness, is simplicity, and then there's the characteristic perceptions of love, beauty, truth, justice, understanding, and those qualities, you might say, themselves are one. So everything to do with the spiritual dimension is oneness. So with the sense of love, it's simply love is one. So it's not love of, say, nature. It's not love of music. It's not love of another person. It's not the love of the universe or the love of a dream or the love of anything in particular, inwardly and outwardly. Is simply love. Now you could say, in the scheme of things, what's the purpose? I mean, if there's no function within the self and the one, then what's the purpose? I mean, if you're sitting in a room and you have compassion for the world, the world as one, or the universe as one, or nature and the animals as one, but if you're just Say you're thinking about, in your conscious, you're thinking about, the problems in the world, the conflict, the violence going on. Now, as you think those thoughts of violence going on in different parts of the world, and the kind of tragic element of the human condition, that's your identification. You're identifying with that. You're remembering that. You're recognizing that. Now, self, obviously, yourself is aware, you're aware of your consciousness, you're aware of thinking those thoughts and identifying that particular thing that you're referring to, the suffering or the violence. And self simply is aware of that in the one. And as you might say, what's produced in your consciousness then brings about the necessary, or the, let's put it this way, the corresponding quality of spiritual perception. So if it's the identification of suffering in the world, which you're thinking in your consciousness, then in your spiritual perception, you'll awaken compassion. Now, if you sit in a room and you have compassion for the world, as it were, the tragic element, what's the point of that compassion? I mean, what's that compassion doing? What's the value of the one? What's the value of a spiritual perception? Well, from the point of consciousness, which wants to identify some kind of activity, so in consciousness, you want to do something about the problems in the world. You want to think about it and work it out, and maybe, you know, end up participating or getting involved or feeling sorry for people, etc. And in the spiritual perception of compassion, because it's not a function, it's more of a perception or perceptual awareness, then as self, you simply are what you are. It's not about interpreting self and the one as a function of consciousness or a function of the body. So if it's a non-functional state, a non-utilitarian state of mind, then that's what it is. And it's not a concern of your own, what the one is doing in the world, what the one is doing in terms of your own sense of self, but what the one is doing in itself, or what the one is doing in other people. And my idea is that the one is within each person as an attribute or an aspect of self. Only, in a sense, people don't understand the distinction between self and ego or identity. And unless you make that distinction, there's a conflation between identity and self. So a lot of people talk about the illusion of self, the illusion of ego, which in one sense it is right, because thought is a kind of illusory process. Thought is an ephemeral process. Thought is rooted in fantasy and imagination. And to say that the identity ego is the self is a misunderstanding. And a lot of evolutionists and neurophysiologists and atheists, they throw out the baby with the bathwater by conflating self and ego, or self and identity. And that's true for a lot of schools of Buddhism as well. So self, or in myself, as it were, myself, in the one, having spiritual perceptions, I simply accept the fact that I don't know what they're doing, I don't know what their effect is. I'm not conscious of their effect, I'm not conscious of what they're doing, because to be conscious and to know is an attribute, are attributes of consciousness. So consciousness doesn't apply to the one. It's like saying, well, if I take a walk through the park and I see a big oak tree, and I look at the oak tree, and you could say, well, what's the oak tree doing? I mean, the oak tree itself, or you could say the moon, or you could say the river. I mean, what's it doing? Well, obviously in the physical universe, everything is doing something. But we can also understand aesthetically that oak tree is a very beautiful form, a very beautiful object. But that oak tree, you might say, has many aspects to it. It's wood. Out of its wood you can make furniture. And one of the things you can do is see it as a beautiful tree, as a landscape artist. So equally, I would say the self has all these aspects, but it's simply the self and the one, but it has all these aspects, you might say, of spiritual perceptions of love and beauty and truth. And they are what they are. So the tree is what the tree is. You can make wood out of it, you can see it as a beautiful object, the birds can land in the tree and make a nest, etc. So I would say the self, in one sense, is in a state of innocence. It's in a state of not knowing, of you could say, of not being, of not existing, of not being an object, of not being a subject. So, anything in consciousness you want to describe the one as, or the self as, is inappropriate. So in a sense, language is inappropriate as a measure of the one. So if you sit in a dark room and you're watching a film, you're not concerned with your body when you're watching the film, you're just looking at the film, you're not self-conscious of your body, and you're engrossed in the film, totally engrossed in the film. And in a sense, you might say, you're looking at the film through the medium of your consciousness, you're identifying, you're recognizing, you're following the plot, you're analysing, you're feeling, you're sensing, you're intuiting, you're understanding, you're comprehending in your consciousness. So you're totally involved in your consciousness. And self, the one, you might say, is pretty much like the body in the dark. It simply is what it is, and because it's not doing anything, it's not interfering with anything, then it's simply not involved. So your body's not involved, and your self in the one is not involved when you're watching a picture. If you're walking down by the river, you're not specifically self-conscious of your body, and you can be not self-conscious of your thinking and your feeling. So you're not projecting anything onto the river and its environment. So you're not being mystical, you're not being ascetic, you're not being romantic or anything like that. You're just simply self in the one, looking at the totality and the oneness of everything around you. You can suspend recognition, you could suspend projection, identification. And if you see the beauty, the order and the beauty, then you're using that particular spiritual perception. I think the idea that there is some aspect of reality, you might say, or some aspect of the human being that is non-functional, like the one, the mind, is very difficult to understand. I mean, the spiritual tradition, the wisdom tradition, tells you about the One or God or Nirvana, that kind of thing. And to those people interested in it, and those people that have had certain kinds of awakening or certain kinds of awareness, maybe they've touched upon this, and maybe, that they pursue it further and have a taste for it. But in the ordinary sense of daily living, of getting things done in the world, of getting things done through your consciousness, through your behaviour, the idea that there's something that's not functional is obviously a mystery if you haven't read the sacred books and you hear ideas of Buddhism and that kind of thing, and it's one's ego identity wants to know what to do and how to do that, and how to practice meditation in order to acquire this understanding or insight. But as I say, in the flow of history, in the flow of society, and making things happen in the world, it's irrelevant to certain points of view, like evolutionists and atheists and people like that. They're not interested in something that might imply transcendence of the physical body and transcendence of the psyche, and the idea of the self would be of no interest to those kind of people. So if like me, you feel that the self and the One, it is something that has happened to you, and there may be a transcendental aspect beyond death, beyond the body, then in a sense you're very alone with that understanding. And even people that say they're spiritual and interested in Buddhism, etc., that they can question the nature of the self and feel there is no self. So again, my point of view that the self is the essence of the One, is the essence of nirvana and satori enlightenment. That's probably, you might say, in the Advaita non-duality and Buddhist sections of meditation, that's not the case for them. So you might say very few people value the idea that the self actually is objective, that the self actually is, you might say, an eternal factor. But of course, when you're in the One, everything to do with consciousness is irrelevant, in the sense that you're not analytical, you're not questioning anything, you're not concerned with neurophysiology or meditation or anything like that, in the sense of practicing, of trying to achieve a goal. And so it really doesn't matter. I mean, to me, it doesn't actually matter what the rest of the world thinks. Literally, it doesn't. And in self, in One, as it were, there's a sense of freedom, and the freedom is also non-specific, so that whatever you consider in the physical universe via the body-brain, or that you consider in the psyche via consciousness, thought and memory, none of that actually matters. None of that has a bearing on the sense of freedom you feel. So it's not that you're free from those things, it's that you're in a sense of pure freedom, so it must be freedom from all of that as well. But it's not freedom from that, it's not an escape. And also, there's no argument, so I would never defend myself against anybody questioning the reality I feel that self and the mind has. So I'd never defend that. I'd never use my consciousness in defense of myself or the one. And if other people don't understand that, if other people ridicule that, if other people are skeptical, it really doesn't matter at all. I mean, if you're in a room and you're reading a taboo book, you're reading that taboo book in the room, and the rest of the world, you know, is irrelevant if you want to read. And the same way, if you want to climb quite a dangerous mountain, you go alone and you do that, regardless of the rest of the world. The rest of the world might think you're mad or suicidal or taking too much risk or whatever, and you're risking your family, you're risking your life, you're risking your image. But to the person doing it, it's all irrelevant. And I think at some level in each individual, I think that each individual at some level does have a sense of autonomy, does have a sense of using their own intelligence. And I think what that means is, even though it's manifesting in consciousness that you're autonomous and that you're independent and that you're going to make your own decision, whether regardless of the rest of the world, I feel that's the self in you, you might say, coming through, because it's self which is independent and indivisible. It's self that can move out of the dilemma of consciousness. It's self that's in essence free. But when you're acting in your consciousness, the very activity of that consciousness, you might say, veils the self, veils the fact that the self is really where you're perceiving things from. So I would say all the higher level qualities of compassion, understanding, and senses of non-violence, you could say, and justice, they're coming from spiritual perceptions within yourself. And I think also that intelligence, which is, you might say, the specific effect on consciousness that's connected to the spiritual dimension, I think it's that intelligence which is informing what we might call genius. So all the cultural processes of philosophy, art, music, science, all the so-called higher activity in that sense going on in consciousness and culture is actually inspired from that intelligence that's rooted in the spiritual dimension. And that intelligence is also connected to the insight that creative people require in order to create something new out of the old. So if you're studying the quantum field and you have an insight into the next step, or you're painting a picture and you have an insight into the next step that takes history further along, then that intelligent insight is actually rooted in the spiritual nature of the self. So self in the one is non-functional, but the effect might be in consciousness through the activity of intelligence, insight and genius, as it were, that something new is created within consciousness. And another aspect, I think, of the, you might say, the non-functionality of self and one, and the functionality of intelligence and insight in the world, is what's called revelation. And broadly speaking, revelation works within the field of synchronicity, and synchronicity essentially embodies the whole concept of the paranormal or the parapsychological. So you could say, in one sense, that synchronicity, revelation, emerges in the psychic dimension and the physical dimension, in the field of synchronicity, from the, you might say, interface between the spiritual and the psychophysical. So we're talking about a kind of interface that is a connection between what's non-causal and what's causal. So you could say the non-causality of the one and the causality of the psychic and the physical that there must be a kind of interface between the two. And likewise, there must be an interface between psyche consciousness and the body-brain. So the three distinct dimensions of spirit, psyche and body, they must have interfaces, there must be ways of those three levels communicating or being in touch with one another. So I can function in the world equally well within the mind, the one mind, the psyche, consciousness and the body. They can all work together, they can be in correspondence. So you're walking by the river, and in terms of seeing and hearing and sensing the water, the trees, the birds and everything, that can be a very physical, organic, sensory perception. And then if you start seeing more imaginative and aesthetic and romantic things through your consciousness and psyche, then you can see that as well. And then from the mind you see everything as one, in a kind of as an integral whole, and a sense of freedom and a kind of movement of freedom and order from the one mind, and they can be all working together, or they can be working in combination, or they could be working independently. I mean, if you're walking along and you say you see a very beautiful wild flower, you may want to pick the wild flower and take it back to the house and put it in a vase and put it on the windowsill. Now you could say the flower represents innocence. Now, if you think of the self as innocent, and you think of the child as being innocent, and you think of nature in general as being innocent, that they're simply what they are, they're not putting on a show, they are what they are. And in terms of the self is what it is. The self is innocent in that there's no attributes, there's no conditions, it simply is what it is. It's open, it's one, it's simple. And that's just like the flower. And it is what it is. So we take a bird, say a beautiful bird, and put it in a cage. But you can't put the self in a cage. You can't do anything with the self. The self is one, the self is in emptiness, and the self isn't under the control of the body, brain, or the psyche consciousness. There's nothing that the body and the psyche can do about the self. And there's nothing you can actually do about the body and the psyche. The self is the self. However, what you do in your body and what you do in your psyche consciousness, it is important to the self. But as I say, the spiritual perceptions are non-causal, and yet I do think there's a way that they interface with the world around in a kind of synchronicity. So you could say there is a kind of synchronicity with what they call the macrocosm and the microcosm. So if you took the macrocosm to be the one, and the microcosm to be the psychophysical nature of body and consciousness, or the nature of consciousness and the world, then you could say there's a synchronistic rapport that's working on a non-causal base, from a non-causal base. So love does affect the world, compassion does affect the world, the one does affect the world. But it's not necessarily measurable. It's not necessarily measurable. You could say that you can't find yourself because you are yourself. So you can't find yourself within your brain, and you can't find yourself within consciousness, because you are yourself. You cannot not be yourself, but you can not be your identity, and you can not be your body. Although I haven't, you might say, gone beyond my physical body into a transcendental level of the spirit, I'm only experiencing or understanding the spiritual dimension as an embodied, immanent sense. But by implication, I can see that the self and the mind is something very, very different from my consciousness and my body. But theoretically, according to the sacred texts, that there ought to be a transcendental dimension beyond the physical body and beyond the psyche, so that when you actually die, you can go there. That's the idea in the Bardo Tadol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And if you don't go into the clear light of the one mind, when you leave your body before death or during death, then you enter the intermediate state, and then you could continue in a kind of dream state, in a altered state in the psyche, which would be a kind of extension of the dream state that you enter when you leave your body, as it were, and go into a dream. So when I see people arguing about the nature of ego and identity and conflating that with self, there's nothing I can do about it. I mean, there's nothing I would say to those people. If people are actually in a confusion about the distinction between ego, identity and self, I wouldn't participate in any discussion. Because I am myself, as it were, and there's nothing to say, there's nothing to do. And if people are unaware of that, or ignorant of that, or dismissive of that, and they, in a sense, dismiss self from their own life and dismiss self in general, that's very much like symbolically dismissing the child or dismissing the animal, as it were. You're dismissing the innocence because it has no overt value. It's not a utility, it's not a function. But of course, most parents, they do have an understanding of the innocence of a child, and they want to protect that innocence. And in that relationship of innocence, their own self-innocence is there. The presence of their own self and oneness is actually there. But again, they're not necessarily making the distinction between self and ego. But there's one thing about self, that it certainly is not egocentric. When you're intimately sharing something with good intentions and a certain quality of kindness and understanding within your identity, within your consciousness, that itself is a reflection of the innocence and openness and love and compassion of the self in the one. So however you look at it, that comes through. So even if you don't actually know that your relationship with the innocence of a child, with your child in its innocence, is yourself. I mean, in the end, it doesn't really matter, and you can live your whole life and not make a distinction between self and identity. But you can be sure that where there's no ego, then that would be self. Because ego, by implication, will always be egocentric. You can modify that. You could be more generous and more kind and more intimate and more loving. But there's always a limit. So that even if you say you love the child in its innocence, you're also telling the child what to do. You're conditioning the child. You're controlling and manipulating the child at the same time. So the child kind of lives in a contradictory world, a black and white world where you're, a kind of reward and punishment and good and evil. That whole duality exists within the identification process of consciousness based on knowledge and duality. So no matter how kind you are to your child, there's always a negative side to that. Whereas self, the one, there is no fragmentation, there is no identification. Therefore, you mean what you say, or you mean what you do. So consciousness, you might say, serves the one and the self. So the self, you could say, acting intelligently through consciousness, will do the right thing within the right context, through the level of intelligence and insight, will know what to do to put things right, or to do the right thing. And in Buddhism, that's known as the law, the Dharma, the law of righteousness, doing the right thing, getting it right, which I would say is also the signature of synchronicity, which creates order, which creates a correspondence, which is known as the sympathy of all things, which is an aspect of eros, love. So right relationship is really a relationship of love, the sympathy of all things, which is also known as the music of the spheres, the harmony of the spheres, because you're in harmony with the cosmos, as above, so below, the macrocosm and the microcosm. So there are indications and signs in the human being where the self is coming through. So you might say, in a person's life, when there are periods or moments of wholeness, well-being, they're indications of the one, the harmony of the one. So I would say what puts order into the body and the psyche within the human being is actually the one. It's the one, you might say, enfolding the psychophysical, that actually keeps things in order, keeps things circulating, keeps things in balance, in a kind of equilibrium. So no matter what you do with your body or your consciousness, no matter the conditions you're in, the stress and the challenges and troubles and conflicts in your life, there will be moments of understanding, moments of insight, moments of spiritual perceptions, moments of oneness and wholeness. And people might think that's a blessing, or that's grace, or it's a revelation. But it's simply, you might say, the presence of yourself, the one, which is always there, working in the background, you might say.